Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
The Foul Glen Lace. Chapter 1. An Unravelling at Foul Glen. The village of Foul Glen was not known for scandal. Nestled between soft hills and tangled hedgerows, its most pressing excitement was the annual garden show or, on occasion, a misplaced delivery at the post office. But on this crisp autumn morning, the villagers had something grander to discuss: the reopening of the Lace Museum. It was an airy, ivy-wrapped building at the end of Mallow Street, once the old rectory and now home to bobbins, samplers, and priceless antique lace. Closed for months due to renovations and a curious funding dispute, its reopening drew the polite curiosity of the village, and one, Miss Jane Marple, who had always found lace rather revealing. So many holes, she often thought, and yet everything held together. The museum doors opened at 10 o'clock. By 1:15, the exhibit room was abuzz with murmured compliments and the light clinking of porcelain cups. Miss Marple, dressed in a dove-grey coat and holding her handbag like a quiet companion, arrived precisely on time. She accepted a cup of weak tea from the vicar's wife, murmured a kind word about the cucumber sandwiches, and took her place near a long display of hand-woven collars. She was not the only one who noticed the tension in the room, only, perhaps, the only one who didn't ignore it. Standing near the main display was Mrs. Cordelia Faucet, the museum's formidable curator. Tall, with the kind of rigid posture one associates with Victorian portraits, Mrs. Faucet wore a severe black dress and a strand of jet beads. She greeted guests with clipped efficiency, her eyes flicking over their shoulders even as she spoke. Near the fireplace, Reverend Giles Maynard sipped his tea with visible discomfort. His wife, Dora, fluttered beside him like a moth that had grown too fond of lamps. Such a triumph for Cordelia, she whispered to no one in particular, especially after all that trouble with the funding, you know. Edward Blake, the museum's financial secretary, stood stiffly near the refreshments table. His thinning hair was combed with discipline, and his gaze lingered just a second too long on the wine decanter, though only tea was being served. Miss Marple's own gaze lingered on a display in the corner, a framed sampler, its thread slightly faded, its letters carefully stitched. "Virtue is a lace that never unravels." She found it charmingly ironic. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp exchange behind her. "No, Agnes. That piece is not to be touched." Mrs. Faucet's voice was low but carried like the snap of starched linen. A young woman, Agnes Bell, the museum assistant, drew her hand back quickly from a lace fan encased in glass. I was just straightening the label," Agnes murmured, her face flushing. "It was crooked." Mrs. Faucet's eyes narrowed. "These pieces are delicate. Your role does not include handling them. Please remember that." An awkward silence followed. The Reverend coughed into his sleeve. Someone poured tea a bit too loudly. Miss Marple sipped hers calmly. She noted the tremble in Agnes's hand, the slight twitch at the corner of Mrs. Faucet's mouth, and the way Mr. Blake busied himself polishing an already clean teaspoon. Something, she thought, had frayed beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, after the guests had wandered off, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky turning the color of faded lavender. She thought about the lace fan, Victorian, most likely, but there was something unusual about the pattern. Or had it been the positioning? She brushed the thought aside. Perhaps it was only that Mrs. Faucet had been unusually short-tempered. Or perhaps... A sound interrupted her thoughts. A sharp, distant scream. It came from the direction of the museum. Miss Marple paused, a gust of wind stirring the hem of her coat. Then, silence. She waited, listened. Nothing more. The village would learn the next morning that Mrs. Cordelia Faucet had been found dead, slumped in her office chair. The cause? A sudden cardiac event, Dr. Fulbright would say. Most unfortunate, but not uncommon in women of her age. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the news had travelled faster than the milk cart. Mrs. Petherbridge was knocking on Miss Marple's door, breathless despite the mild weather. "Have you heard?" she asked without preamble, her cheeks flushed like stewed plums. Miss Marple, who had just sat down to her toast, gave a soft nod. "Yes." Such a sudden thing. Quite distressing. Distressing? Mrs. Petherbridge dropped heavily into a chair. "My cousin Enid says the body was still warm when Agnes Bell found her. Stiff in her office like a broken puppet. They say her mouth was open, like she'd been startled, not just gone quietly." Miss Marple offered tea, which was waved off. "Dr. Fulbright says her heart gave out, but I don't like it, Jane. Cordelia may have been a difficult woman, but she was always sharp. And you've heard about the lace fan, haven't you?" Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "What about it?" "Gone. Vanished. They've removed the whole case. Agnes told Enid that Edward Blake ordered it boxed up before the police even arrived. And," she lowered her voice, "the fan was hers, you know. Cordelia's. A private donation. Some say it wasn't quite legitimate how she acquired it." Miss Marple spread a thin layer of marmalade on her toast. "I wonder what prompted such urgency." By midday, the village air had turned brittle with suspicion. At the post office, Reverend Maynard stood rigid beside the parcel counter. "I'm simply saying," he muttered, "that Mrs. Faucet was not the kind to overexert herself. Something must have brought it on. Stress, perhaps. She had enemies, you know." That evening, the local constable, Sergeant Webb, paid Miss Marple a visit. He was new to Fir Glen and bore the fresh shine of procedural training and an unfortunate distrust of old ladies. "Just following up with key witnesses," he said, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Petherbridge mentioned you were present at the museum." "I was," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Did you see anything unusual?" "Many things, Sergeant," she replied. "But nothing I would describe as officially suspicious." He blinked. "Meaning," she said gently, "that people are often most revealing when they believe they're saying nothing at all." He frowned, unsure if he was being mocked. "Well, the doctor says it was a heart attack." "Clean as you like." "I'm sure he did," she replied. "That Agnes girl seems nervous," he said, flipping a page in his notebook. "You think she's hiding something?" Miss Marple considered this. "I think she's afraid, Sergeant." "That isn't always the same thing." He scratched his jaw. "We'll keep looking into it. I expect it'll all settle down in a few days." "I hope not too quickly," she murmured. He did not ask what she meant. Perhaps it was just as well. By nightfall, rain tapped softly at the windows. In the darkness of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, darning a woolen cuff. She thought of the intricate patterns of lace, of a quarrel over a crooked label, and of a glass case that had been spirited away before anyone had a chance to ask why. Human nature, she reflected, was very much like lace-making. It was in the spaces between the threads that the real design was to be found. And in this case, the empty space left by the fan seemed to be the most telling part of the pattern. Chapter 2: A Tidy Explanation. By the third day, the official story of heart failure had settled over Fau Glen like a poorly ironed linen sheet, creased in places, and not entirely convincing to anyone who looked closely. The more skeptical villagers amended their pronouncements with, well, she was under a great deal of stress, as if stress had become a suitable stand-in for murder. Miss Marple, of course, was not satisfied with neat explanations that ignored untidy truths. That morning, she made a quiet call on Mr. Edward Blake. His cottage, just past the village green, was neat, symmetrical, and entirely devoid of warmth. Mr. Blake, she observed, had a garden no one walked in and a wife no one had seen in nearly a year, though rumour insisted she was recuperating in Bath. He greeted Miss Marple at the door in his shirt-sleeves, a pencil tucked behind one ear. His smile was professional and just slightly over-aimed. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding," she said, though her tone made it clear she knew she was. "Not at all. Just going over the donation ledger." He gestured her into a sparse and exacting sitting room where books were arranged by spine color, but he did not offer tea. "I understand you've taken on quite the responsibility at the museum," she began, settling onto the edge of an armchair. "Temporarily, yes," Blake replied, smoothing his shirt cuff. "Agnes is handling the administration, but the board agreed I should coordinate the transition. It's all very sudden, of course." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Sudden things often are." She let a brief silence stretch before continuing. "I notice the lace fan is no longer on display. It was such a lovely piece." Mrs. Faucet spoke of it with great pride. His smile thinned. "The fan has been secured. Standard procedure. Valuable items are withdrawn during police reviews." "But the police were not yet reviewing anything when it was removed, were they, Mr. Blake?" Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as ever. "I believe you had it packed away before Sergeant Webb had even been summoned." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Faucet was particular. "I was merely following what I believed her wishes would be, to protect the museum's most valuable assets in the event of any disruption." "And it was her asset, wasn't it?" "A private donation, I hear." A pause. "Privately, yes. There was no formal paperwork, but the museum considered it part of her legacy." "How very trusting," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet, you felt it necessary to act with such haste. One might almost think you had reason to believe its presence was relevant." "I had no reason to believe anything of the sort," he said, his voice now as starched as his collar. Miss Marple stood. "I won't take up any more of your time. I wonder, did Mrs. Faucet ever mention feeling unsafe? Or threatened?" Blake looked briefly surprised. "No. She was quite firm on boundaries. She didn't concern herself with gossip or small threats. She was, well, she was Cordelia." Miss Marple nodded as if that answered everything. She left the cottage with more questions than she had arrived with. The fan had been removed too quickly, the donation was undocumented, and Edward Blake was altogether too rehearsed. Human nature, as she well knew, was anything but tidy. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Dora Maynard greeted her with the enthusiasm of someone expecting to be useful. "Oh, Jane, do come in. Between you and me," she began, lowering her voice the moment the door was closed, "I never quite trusted Cordelia. Even her compliments felt like sharpened teaspoons. Over tea, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation. Did she have any close relationships? Friends? Hardly. She and Agnes were thick as thieves for a while, then something changed. A row about a display, I think. Cordelia said Agnes was getting ideas above her station. Said museums weren't for sentiment. Dora leaned in. And you know, at the reopening, she said the strangest thing to me. She looked at one of the older samples and said, one can always tell the difference between what's handmade and what's cleverly faked. Then she just walked off. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the handle of her cup. How very curious, she murmured. It was late that afternoon when Sergeant Webb found her tending to her roses. He no longer looked like a man dealing with a simple case of heart failure. His face was grim, and his notebook was open to a fresh page. There's been a development, Miss Marple, he said, foregoing any pleasantries. The coroner's full report came in this morning. They found traces of something in her system. Digitalis. Foxglove, Miss Marple said softly, looking at the tall, bell-flowered stalks growing wild at the edge of her own garden. Exactly. Not enough to act fast, he says. But a consistent, small dose over time, it would perfectly mimic the symptoms of a failing heart. Quiet, untraceable, unless one knew precisely what to look for. So it was not a sudden thing at all, Miss Marple reflected. It was a patient one. It was murder, Webb confirmed, his voice heavy. We found traces of it in an unmarked tin of loose-leaf tea in her office. Someone has been poisoning her for weeks. He looked at her then, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. You said some people are most revealing when they think they're saying nothing. I'm beginning to think you were right. Miss Marple snipped a withered rose from its stem. The neat explanation had come apart, just as she'd suspected it would. Now, all the threads were loose, and the true, far darker pattern was beginning to show. Someone had not simply wanted Cordelia Faucet dead, they had wanted it to look as if she had simply faded away. And that, she thought, was not the work of a person in a fit of passion. It was the work of someone very clever and very, very cold. Chapter 3: The Convenient Villain. The word a murder has a particular resonance in a village like Faucet. It is a word too large, too coarse for the quiet lanes and manicured gardens. It landed with the weight of a fallen oak, shattering the fragile peace. Suddenly, every exchanged glance over a garden wall held a new significance, and every closed curtain seemed to hide a dark possibility. The convenient theory of a weak heart was discarded, in its place grew a tangled vine of suspicion, and its tendrils quickly began to wrap around one person, Agnes Bell. She was, after all, the one who had found the body. She had been the curator's assistant, privy to her routines, and the maker of her daily tea. And, as everyone now recalled with grim satisfaction, she had been publicly admonished by Mrs. Faucet on the very day she died. By midday, Agnes had been transformed from a shy, overlooked young woman into a convenient villain, stitched together from fragments of innuendo and strained glances. Sergeant Webb, now tasked with a murder inquiry, acted accordingly. Agnes was not arrested, not yet, but she was asked to accompany him to the parish hall for a formal interview. Miss Marple was already at the hall, arranging flowers for the harvest festival with a few other ladies from the parish. It was, she assured the sergeant, no trouble at all for them to continue their work quietly in the corner while he used the main table. Webb, suspecting he was being managed but seeing no polite way to refuse, reluctantly agreed. From behind a large vase of chrysanthemums, Miss Marple had a perfect, unobstructed view. Agnes sat opposite the sergeant, her shoulders rounded like a wilting leaf. Her hands were clutched in her lap, still and white. "I just want to be clear," Sergeant Webb began, tapping his pencil. "You were the last person known to see Mrs. Faucet alive." "I was finishing the display logs," Agnes said, her voice a thin thread. "She told me to go home, that she had some accounts to check." "And you made her a pot of tea before you left?" "Yes. As I did every afternoon. From the tin she kept in her office." "The tin of special herbal blend?" Webb asked, his eyes fixed on her. "The one with no label?" Agnes blinked slowly. She preferred it. She said it settled her nerves. "The coroner found traces of digitalis in that tea, Miss Bell." "Foxglove." "It grows wild all along the path by the allotments, the path you take to get home." He did not phrase it as a question. Agnes stared at him, her face paling further. I don't know anything about that." "But you argued with her," Webb pressed on. "Several people witnessed it. She was angry with you." "It was nothing," Agnes whispered. "A misunderstanding about a label. She was very particular. Particular enough for you to wish her ill." From her corner, Miss Marple shifted her weight slightly, the creak of a floorboard the only sound in the tense room. She noted that Agnes's fear, while profound, did not seem to be the fear of discovery. It was something else, the terror of a cornered animal that does not understand the nature of the trap. "She didn't let anyone else touch her tea," Agnes said softly, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "She would have noticed if it tasted different. Perhaps not, if the taste was disguised. Or if she trusted the person who made it." Webb leaned back, his face set. "It doesn't look good, Miss Bell. You had the access, the opportunity, and, some might say, the motive." Agnes looked as if she might break. Just as the sergeant prepared to ask another question, Miss Marple stepped forward, holding a drooping dahlia. "Oh, dear me, Sergeant, do forgive me," she said, her voice flustered. "This water needs changing. I just had a thought, so silly, I'm sure. But in all this talk of tea tins, it occurred to me that museum records must be so very complicated." Webb blinked, thrown off course. "What?" "Well, all those donations and ledgers," Miss Marple continued, moving towards the door. "One imagines a forger could have a field day. I suppose Mr. Blake's records are all in perfect order?" Mrs. Faucet mentioned to Agnes once, I believe, that she was concerned someone had been tampering with the donation records. Webb's frown deepened. "That's the first I've heard of it." "Oh, then do pay me no mind," she said sweetly. "As I said, a silly thought." She glanced at Agnes with a look of pure sympathy before disappearing out of the door. The spell was broken. Webb's confident line of questioning now had a small, untidy hole in it. Later, as a grey dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple found Agnes sitting on a stone bench in the churchyard. "You shouldn't have interrupted," Agnes said, her voice flat. "It will only look worse for me now." "I doubt you could look much worse in the eyes of a village that has already made up its mind," Miss Marple replied, sitting beside her. "People prefer stories they can carry in their pockets. You, I suspect, have always been rather too large for that." Agnes gave a weak, humorless smile. After a long silence, she finally turned to the older woman. "There is something I didn't tell him. I was too afraid." Miss Marple waited. "The night she died," Agnes said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "just before she sent me home, she was staring at the case with the fan in it. She seemed agitated. I asked if something was wrong. Agnes took a shaky breath. She looked at me and said, "Things are getting messy, Agnes. I made a mistake years ago, and it's finally coming home." And then she said, "If anything happens to me, follow the fan." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The fan again. Not just a piece of lace, then. It was a signpost. "Why didn't you tell the police this?" she asked gently. Agnes looked away, across the weathered gravestones. "Because I thought they would think I was making it up to save myself. And because the way she said it, it sounded like she knew something was about to happen. It sounded as if she knew who was coming for her." Chapter 4: What the Catalogue Said. The tide of village opinion, once it turns, is as powerful and unthinking as the sea. Agnes Bell was now adrift in its chill waters. Shopkeepers served her with a brisk, averted gaze. Conversations fell silent as she passed on the high street. She was a ghost in her own life, and the village, having decided upon its villain, was content to let the official investigation run its course. Sergeant Webb, Miss Marple heard, was building a methodical case, piece by circumstantial piece. Miss Marple, however, found that methodical thinking was often a way of avoiding the truth rather than finding it. The truth, in her experience, was rarely so straightforward. It was a tangled skein of wool, and one had to find the right loose end to pull. For her, that end remained the lace fan. On a grey and drizzly afternoon, she sat by her parlour window, a stack of village pamphlets and programmes on a small table beside her. She had kept them for years, souvenirs from fêtes, garden shows, and, of course, the Lace Museum. She found what she was looking for in a catalogue from the previous spring, a modest booklet with a slightly faded photograph of a lace collar on the cover. She flipped through the brittle pages, pausing at an entry titled Fan, Number 12, Black Chantilly Lace, Victorian Era. Beneath the description was a small note in what was recognizably Cordelia Faucet's precise, academic hand, donor, anonymous. Origin, disputed, likely continental. Miss Marple lowered the booklet to her lap. Anonymous. Disputed. How very strange. Edward Blake had been adamant it was Cordelia's personal legacy, a story Mrs. Petherbridge and the rest of the village had accepted without question. But here, in print, was a formal record of doubt, authored by Cordelia herself. Why would a woman so proud, so possessive, allow such ambiguity to be published about her prize exhibit? Unless, of course, she had no other choice. Unless she was protecting not her ownership, but the secret of how she had come by it. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by the grocer's under the guise of needing ginger biscuits. Mrs. Calthorpe, who ran the counter with a near-religious attention to village affairs, was only too happy to chat. "A terrible business, that museum mess," she said, weighing out a quarter-pound of biscuits into a brown paper bag. "Though I never did trust that lace fan, you know. Bad energy." "Oh?" Miss Marple asked lightly, her interest piqued. "Well, when they first displayed it in the spring, it was right in the front cabinet. Then one day, puff! Gone." Mrs. Calthorpe leaned forward conspiratorially. "Agnes told me it was away for cleaning, but I overheard Cordelia herself in here saying it had been misfiled. Imagine that! Misplacing a priceless thing like that. And it did reappear. Weeks later. No explanation. Just back in its case as if nothing had happened." Mrs. Calthorpe lowered her voice. "That fan's got a history, mark my words. Some say it belonged to a dancer. Others say it came from a French estate, confiscated during the war. That's why no one's listed as the donor. It wasn't ever meant to be in anyone's hands. With the biscuits tucked in her bag, Miss Marple felt a familiar click in her mind, the sound of disparate facts locking into place. An anonymous donation, a disputed origin, a sudden disappearance and reappearance. And Cordelia's strange remark to Dora Maynard, one can always tell the difference between what's handmade and what's cleverly faked. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, the remark was not about lace-making at all. Perhaps it was about the fan itself. She encountered Edward Blake on the path returning from the post office. He gave her a curt nod, clearly intending to pass by. "Mr. Blake, a moment," she said, her tone mild. "I was just reminiscing over an old museum catalogue. So interesting how things are recorded. The Chantilly fan, for instance." His posture stiffened. "What about it?" "It was listed with a disputed origin," she said, as if remarking on the weather. It struck me as such a curious phrase. I wondered what the dispute could possibly have been about. For a fleeting second, a look of pure fury crossed Blake's face before being swiftly replaced by his usual mask of professional indifference. "A clerical error," he said sharply. Cordelia was most displeased. "It was corrected in later printings." "Ah, I see," Miss Marple said, though she did not see at all. A lie, she thought, told with the haste of someone trying to cover a hole. She walked home, the drizzle failing to dampen her thoughts. The story of the fan was the forgery, not the lace. Cordelia Faucet had not been the proud owner of a precious heirloom, she had been the custodian of a dangerous secret. A secret she had published, however cryptically, in her own catalogue. A secret that had caused her to remove the fan from display, and a secret that had, in the end, provided the true, untidy motive for her murder. Someone else in Faucet knew the secret of the fan, and that person, unlike Cordelia, was not content to let it remain merely disputed. Chapter 5: The Postmaster's Parcel. The discovery of the scorched lace behind the museum boiler stirred the village more than the death itself. It was found by the gardener's boy, a small, blackened scrap of fabric tucked amongst the coal dust, as if it had been inexpertly tossed towards the furnace and missed its mark. Someone tried to destroy evidence, Dora Maynard declared during a tense gathering of the sewing circle. "Which proves it was a crime of passion." "Or someone was simply cold and careless," the vicar replied, reaching for another scone. But no one, not really, believed that. Sergeant Webb saw it as the final, damning piece of his puzzle. "It's her, no doubt," he told Miss Marple, meeting her on the high street. A clumsy attempt to dispose of the fan after the fact. She panics, tries to burn it, and only manages to destroy a piece. "It all fits." He spoke with the satisfaction of a man who sees his tidy conclusion drawing near. Miss Marple, however, did not think it fitted at all. Later that morning, she asked for permission to see where the fragment had been found. She stood for some time by the old boiler, her gaze taking in the dusty floor and the narrow cellar window. "People don't burn lace unless it means something," she murmured to herself. "Not just aesthetically, but personally. A fire like this, it isn't about destruction. It's about erasure." The act was too small, too incomplete. It was not the work of a panicked girl trying to hide a murder weapon. It felt, to her, like something else entirely. A desperate attempt to erase a signature, perhaps. A maker's mark? Or, she considered, what if the piece was not from the fan they had all seen, but from another? A real one, perhaps, of which the museum's exhibit was merely a clever fake. Her mind returned to Mrs. Calthorpe's gossip about a French estate. Continental, the catalogue had said. The word was a signpost, pointing across the channel and back in time. There was one person in Fow Glen whose memory for such things was as long and reliable as the village records themselves. Mr. Lionel Elcott, the retired postmaster, lived in a modest cottage where the ivy climbed the walls like gossip and the gate creaked its own disapproval. He was a man of formidable eyebrows and mild tea. When Miss Marple arrived, he was already seated in his conservatory with a biscuit tin open at his elbow. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his face brightening. "Come for a story, have you? The post office sees more of life than the church, you know." "Always said so." "I have come for your memory, Mr. Elcott," she replied warmly. "And perhaps your honesty. Two things that fade with age," he chuckled. "But do come in." Miss Marple took a seat and laid out her query, not as a matter of murder, but of historical curiosity. She spoke of the museum, of an interest in pieces acquired just after the war. A difficult time, she mused, with so much changing hands. Mr. Elcott's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table. "Just after the war, you say? It brings to mind the parcel." "A parcel?" He sighed, his gaze drifting to a point somewhere in the distant past. "We had a trunk go through. Early March, 1947. Coldest winter in my memory. A brown leather trunk, plastered with foreign stamps. French ones. Addressed to a Miss Vivian Gray, here in the village." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been clicking softly in her hands, fell still. "That name stuck," Mr. Elcott continued, "because there was no Vivian Gray in Fow Glen. Never had been. I checked the register twice." "And what became of it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Ah, well, that was the thing. It was picked up." "By whom?" Mr. Elcott looked directly at her, his bright, bird-like eyes holding hers. "By Cordelia Faucet. She was new to the village then, working on setting up the museum. Claimed she was collecting it on Miss Gray's behalf. Said the lady was an associate who had been delayed abroad." He shrugged. "I didn't think much of it at the time. The parcel was heavy, mind. Too heavy for just lace. She signed for it, and that was that. But a week later, I found the address label discarded behind the counter. The return address, from somewhere in France, had been carefully torn off. The room was quiet save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall." "And you never reported it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Report what?" "It wasn't illegal to collect someone's post if it was claimed properly." And Cordelia, he gave a dry chuckle, well, she was the kind of woman who made people not ask questions. As Miss Marple walked home, the pieces in her mind rearranged themselves into a stark and startling new pattern. Cordelia Faucet had not simply acquired the fan, she had intercepted it. She had taken possession of a parcel sent from France to a woman who may never have existed. The entire foundation of her reputation, the centerpiece of her museum, was built upon a quiet act of theft committed nearly 30 years ago. The murder, then, was not a beginning. It was an end. It was the final, violent unraveling of a secret that had been held together, like the most delicate lace, by a single, determined thread. And someone had finally decided to snip it. Chapter 6: The Vicar's Ledger. Miss Marple now understood that Cordelia Faucet had curated more than just lace, she had curated secrets. The postmaster's story had provided the foundation, a crime of acquisition buried in the winter of 1947. But what had been done with that secret since? Secrets, she knew, were rarely left to gather dust. They were either a burden or a tool. And Cordelia, Miss Marple suspected, was not the sort of woman to be burdened. She found Reverend Maynard in the churchyard, pruning the roses with a quiet aggression that suggested his thoughts were thornier than any stem. "I always thought Cordelia had a strange hold over the village," he said, clipping a dead head with a vicious snip. He did not look at her. Not affection, exactly. More like a well-managed fear. She knew things. Things people didn't want remembered. Such as? Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated, his shears hovering over a perfect bloom. Let's just say that museum records weren't the only things she kept meticulously. She had correspondence. Photographs. A ledger of sorts. He finally turned to face her, his eyes troubled. She never mentioned it to me. She wouldn't have. But once, during a charity meeting in her office, I glimpsed it in a drawer she'd left ajar. Names. Dates. Peculiar notations beside them. He looked away again. She caught me looking and said, "Some truths need preserving, Reverend, even if the people attached to them don't." "How very Cordelia," Miss Marple murmured. A ledger. The secret of the fan was not just a shield to protect her from her own past, it was a sword she wielded against others. Her theory was bolstered later that morning by a breathless visit from Mrs. Petherbridge, who arrived under the pretense of discussing hymn choices for the Harvest Festival. "Jane, I don't mean to pry, well, that's not true, I do, but have you noticed how Mr. Blake has taken over everything since Cordelia passed?" she began. "He's gone through every drawer, reshuffled the entire inventory system, and cancelled next month's lecture on Belgian lace. Said it was irrelevant to the museum's new mission. And do you know what else?" She leaned closer. "He was seen at Mr. Smythe's, the solicitor's, office yesterday afternoon. No one knows why." Miss Marple filed the information away. A man tidying up records, consolidating control, and consulting a solicitor. Was he an ambitious opportunist, or a conspirator trying to bury evidence? Drawn by a sense of unease, she took a walk past the museum. The doors were locked, but through the window she could see Agnes Bell moving inside, packing away items under the watchful eye of Sergeant Webb. Miss Marple tapped lightly on the glass. Agnes met her at the side door, her face pale and drawn. She was allowed in for an hour a day, she explained, to retrieve personal effects. They stood together in the silent display room, the empty pedestal where the fan had rested looking like a fresh wound. She was going to send it for authentication, Agnes said suddenly, her voice low. To a contact in France. I packed the parcel for her myself, just a week before she died. But she never mailed it. Why not? Agnes shrugged, her gaze fixed on the empty space. She said she wanted to confirm something first. Something about the donor. She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a helpless confusion. She called the donor an accidental thief. Miss Marple turned that phrase over in her mind. An accidental thief. Not a villain, but someone who had ended up with a stolen item, perhaps unknowingly, and then failed to return it once the truth was known. That suggested not just guilt, but fear. The final piece of the day's puzzle was delivered by Sergeant Webb himself. He came to her cottage that evening, his notebook looking worn and his expression grim. He dropped onto her chintz armchair with a heavy sigh. She was blackmailing someone, he said, without preamble. The ledger Reverend Maynard mentioned, we found it. Hidden under a loose floorboard in her office. It's mostly in code, but we've already cracked one. He flipped open his notebook. A recurring payment noted next to the name a Nightingale. It corresponds with several withdrawals from the museum's discretionary fund over the last year. Miss Marple blinked. Blackmail paid with the museum's own money? That's rather ambitious. Cordelia Faucet wasn't short on confidence, Webb muttered. The whole village is in this book, in one way or another. Blake, the vicar, half the parish council. She had a note on every one of them. He looked up at Miss Marple, the tidy certainty he'd felt about Agnes Bell now completely gone. This isn't about a simple grudge anymore. She was sitting on a powder keg. Any one of them could have lit the match. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The ledger explained the fear that permeated the village, but it did not, she thought, explain the fan. The blackmail was a symptom, not the disease. Cordelia had been killed not just because she knew secrets, but because she was on the verge of disturbing the one great secret, the original sin from 1947, that tied them all together. And she now had a name for the person it belonged to, the accidental thief. Chapter 7: The Man Who Vanished. It began, as so many village crises do, with a locked door and a failure to appear. Edward Blake had been scheduled to meet with the museum board at 10 o'clock, a routine gathering to discuss the temporary suspension of acquisition funding. When he hadn't arrived by 1:15, a worried Agnes used her spare key to open his office. The room was unnervingly still. At first glance, everything looked untouched, papers aligned in neat stacks, books squared away, the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco in the air. But two things were wrong. The window sash was open to the damp autumn air, and Blake's overcoat and briefcase were gone from their customary hook. Agnes stepped back, a cold sense of unease creeping over her. She did not call his name. She did not need to. Edward Blake had vanished. By noon, Sergeant Webb stood in the middle of the office, his expression a mixture of frustration and grim satisfaction. Coat, case, an umbrella, all gone, he muttered. No note, no call. He's fled. He wouldn't just leave, said Agnes, her voice trembling. Not without announcing his authority 5 times first. Miss Marple, who had been summoned by a frantic phone call from the vicar's wife, said nothing at first. Her sharp eyes had fixed on a small porcelain cup left on the windowsill. It held the remains of half-drunk tea. There was no lipstick on the rim, no sugar. This would be his, she asked softly. Webb followed her gaze. I imagined so. Still warm. Lukewarm, she corrected gently. He left in a hurry, then. But not without time to finish half a cup. How very contradictory. She stood and paced once around the room, her gaze pausing on the wall calendar. Today's date, the 14th of September, was circled in red ink. Strange, she murmured. He never seemed the sort to romanticize his appointments. The village, of course, responded to Blake's disappearance with its usual brand of measured hysteria. The narrative was simple and satisfying. His run-off with the museum funds. Mrs. Goodwin declared at the bakery. Took what he could and made for France. It's always France with that sort. Or the fan, offered Mr. Nettleby from the watch repair shop. That thing's worth a fortune. Bet it was all planned. Sergeant Webb was inclined to agree. A fleeing culprit simplified matters immensely. His theory was bolstered late that afternoon when Blake's Morris Oxford was found, abandoned behind the derelict greenhouses near Welbeck Farm. No tracks, no signs of struggle, Webb reported to Miss Marple at the scene. The car sat forlornly in a patch of overgrown weeds. Looks like he ditched it and was picked up by someone else. Miss Marple peered into the driver's side footwell. Was anything found inside? Webb paused. A few crumbs, some dried grass, and this. He held up a small evidence bag containing a tiny sliver of fabric. Looks like a bit of embroidered ribbon. Pale green. Miss Marple's knitting, which she had brought with her, paused mid-row. Lace edging, perhaps, she murmured. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. The fan. Perhaps not the fan, she said thoughtfully, but certainly connected to it. You recall the old catalogue mentioned Cordelia's collection included several similar pieces from the same period. A set of 4, I believe she once said, though she only ever displayed one at a time. This new thought propelled Miss Marple and a reluctant Sergeant Webb back to the museum, where Agnes, with shaking hands, unlocked the deep storage room in the archives. It was a place of dust and forgotten things. One by one, they opened the protective drawers of the not-on-display collection. In the third drawer, nestled in acid-free paper, was an empty space. A second fan, a near-perfect mirror of the famous Chantilly lace one, was missing. Agnes sank onto a nearby stool. I didn't even know this one was here. She always acted as if the other was entirely unique. Miss Marple traced the faint indentation where the case had Saturday. No one steals a second fan, she said softly, more to herself than to the others, unless the first one was a copy. The room was silent. The disappearance of Edward Blake was no longer a simple case of a man on the run. The possibility of a replica, of a deliberate switch, reframed the entire mystery. Cordelia's cryptic comment about telling the handmaid from the cleverly faked now echoed with chilling clarity. That evening, a letter arrived at the constable's office. It had been slipped under the door. The typing was neat, the message blunt. You are looking in the wrong direction. The past matters more than the museum. The fan was never Cordelia's to give. Beneath it, a single, handwritten line in faint grey pencil, asked the postmaster about 1947. Chapter 8, The Name on the Parcel. The anonymous letter lay on Sergeant Webb's desk like a thrown gauntlet. Its typed words were a challenge, but it was the penciled postscript that truly troubled him. Ask the postmaster about 1947. Someone is playing games with us, Webb said grimly, holding the note by its edges. He had come directly to Miss Marple's cottage. But why point us to something that happened 30 years ago? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, looking up from her knitting, because they know you would not think to look there yourself. It is not a game, Sergeant. It is a signpost, just like the fan itself. She paused. I have already had a chat with Mr. Elcott. He is a man of remarkable memory. Webb's expression was a study in surprise and grudging admiration. He listened intently as Miss Marple recounted the story of the brown leather trunk, the French stamps, and the non-existent Miss Vivian Grey. An hour later, they were both seated in Mr. Elcott's conservatory. The retired postmaster, delighted to have his story granted official importance, recounted it again, this time adding a small but vital detail. The postmark, he said, tapping his temple. Clear as day. Bayonne. I remember thinking it was a long way for a parcel to come. So Cordelia had taken possession of something not meant for her, something sent from Bayonne to a woman who either never existed or was never meant to receive it in Foul Glen. The anonymous note was not a taunt, it was a confirmation. Someone else knew the story of the intercepted parcel. Was it Blake, trying to guide them from hiding? Or was it the killer, attempting to frame the past itself? Armed with this official testimony, Sergeant Webb now had cause to delve into the museum's oldest and dustiest records. He, Miss Marple, and a still subdued Agnes spent the afternoon in the archive room, the air thick with the scent of beeswax, old linen, and the slow decay of secrets. It was Agnes who found it, in a drawer labeled Acquisitions, 1946 to 1952. Tucked at the very back was a single, yellowed index card, its corner torn, the script a younger, less severe version of Cordelia's hand. Item, lace fan, Chantilly pattern, c. 1860s. Gilded handle with pearl inlay. Source, private delivery via Miss F. Provenance, unknown, POS. Estate clearance, France. Condition, excellent. Note, no display until further verification. Miss F. Webb read over her shoulder. Faucet. She documented her own deception. And her own intentions, Miss Marple added, pointing a delicate finger at the last line. No display until further verification. She knew from the very beginning it was suspect. She chose to ignore her own directive for 30 years. But there was something else. Tucked behind the index card was a folded piece of paper, thin and brittle with age. The writing on it was elegant, looping, and unmistakably French. Miss Marple, whose education at a finishing school in Florence had included excellent French, took the paper carefully. She read the first line aloud, translating softly. To the one who holds what I could not keep. Know that it was never yours. A profound silence filled the dusty room. The words felt like a voice from a ghost, an echo of a long-forgotten injustice. This was not a bill of sale or a donor's letter. It was a warning. A curse, perhaps. Sergeant Webb took the document in his gloved hands. This changes everything. This proves she knew it was stolen property, or at the very least, not rightfully hers. It proves more than that, Miss Marple corrected him gently. It suggests the original owner knew it had been intercepted. This note was not meant for a stranger. It was meant for the thief. That night, as rain began to fall once more, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the dark shift across the hedgerows. The past had not just crept into the present, it had carved its initials into it. The fan was not merely a stolen object, it was a trust betrayed, a message left undelivered for decades. Cordelia had lived her life in possession of stolen property, but also in possession of that damning note. The blackmail ledger, the lies, the murder, they were all frantic attempts to keep that single piece of paper, and the story it told, buried forever. The question was no longer simply who had killed Cordelia, but who was left from that long-ago story. Who was Vivian Gray? Who was the woman from Bayonne who wrote the note? And had their heir, after 30 years of silence, finally come to Faucet to reclaim what was theirs? Chapter 9: The Clause in the Will. The solicitor's office sat just off Merton Lane, half hidden behind a crooked hedge that hadn't been trimmed since the coronation. Inside, everything smelled faintly of parchment and peppermint lozenges. Mr. Leopold Smythe, the village solicitor for over 3 decades, greeted Miss Marple and Sergeant Webb with a short bow and a longer sigh. I wondered how long it would take, he said, already reaching for a manila folder tied with red string. Cordelia Faucet was not the sort to go gently, even in her paperwork. He produced the folder. The top sheet bore the title, Last Will and Testament of Cordelia Margaret Faucet, executed the 3rd of November, 1949. Below it, a line had been added, amended the 12th of February, this year. May we see the amendment? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Smythe slid a separate page across his polished desk. It has not been publicly filed yet, but her intention was made perfectly clear. Webb leaned over to read the spidery script aloud. Addendum. In the event of my death, I request that item number 12 from the Faucet Lace Museum collection, the Chantilly fan, not be retained by the board. Instead, it shall be transferred to the sole care of Miss Agnes Bell, to be disposed of as she sees fit. This instruction supersedes any previous claims of museum ownership. A heavy silence fell in the musty office. The implications were staggering. She was giving it back, Webb breathed. Or trying to. She knew the museum had no legal claim, Miss Marple murmured, tapping the page lightly. By leaving it to Agnes, she was attempting to right a 30-year-old wrong without a public confession. Mr. Smythe cleared his throat. She was most insistent the clause be kept quiet. I asked her why. She looked at me and said, because I have kept it too long already, and Agnes will know what to do. Outside the office, the wind had picked up, rattling the dry leaves along the lane. That changes everything, Webb said as they walked. Cordelia's death wasn't just to keep the secret buried. It might have been to stop this very clause from ever being executed. It provides a powerful new motive, certainly, Miss Marple agreed. It makes one wonder who else might have known of her intentions. She found Agnes at her small rented cottage, packing a box of books with a slow, defeated air. Miss Marple told her, as gently as she could, about the contents of the will. The young woman sank onto a chair, her face a mask of disbelief. To me? Why would she leave it to me? She trusted you, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. But she never said a word, Agnes whispered, her eyes wide. All this time, she was carrying this, and she never said a word. She looked up at Miss Marple, a dawning horror in her expression. That's why she was killed, isn't it? Someone found out she was going to give it away. It seems a very strong possibility, Miss Marple conceded. The final piece of the puzzle arrived that evening. It was not a theory or a memory, but a tangible ghost from the past. A second envelope had been slipped under Sergeant Webb's office door. No postmark, no note. Inside was a single photograph, sepia-toned and curled at the corners. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, her hair swept into a formal wave. She wore a dark, elegant dress, and in her gloved hands, she held the lace fan. On the back, a single line of faint, spidery writing, Bayonne, 1947. Webb brought it straight to Miss Marple's cottage. She took one look and nodded, a sense of profound sadness settling over her. Here she was. The woman from the parcel. She's not English, Miss Marple murmured, holding the photograph under the lamplight. Look at the cut of the dress. The style is quite Parisian for the time. So this is the rightful owner, Webb said, his voice low. I believe so, Miss Marple replied carefully. We are dealing with a theft buried in time, and a crime born from trying to undo it much too late. Webb set the photograph on the table beside the teacups. It lay there, a face finally put to the mystery, a silent accusation from across the years. But that still doesn't explain Blake, he insisted. Why run? No, she agreed, her gaze fixed on the young woman's sad, proud eyes. It doesn't. Unless, of course, Mr. Blake did not vanish to escape justice, but to protect someone. She looked from the photograph to the window, out into the dark village. Perhaps, she said softly, he went looking for the woman in this picture. Or perhaps, he was trying to hide from her. Chapter 10, An Unveiling at the Museum. It was a quiet morning when Miss Marple made her move. There were no formal announcements, no sudden accusations, just a soft suggestion placed as carefully as a pin in silk. She requested that the principal parties involved in the matter of Mrs. Faucet's death gather at the Lace Museum at 11 o'clock. It was not an official summons, merely an invitation to clear the air, but it carried a weight that made refusal impossible. By 11, they were all there, standing awkwardly amongst the glass cases in the main exhibit room. Reverend and Mrs. Maynard stood stiff with anticipation. Agnes Bell, pale but composed, waited quietly by the covered pedestal in the center of the room. Sergeant Webb stood near the door, arms crossed, observing. Just as a tense silence was about to become unbearable, the main door opened. Edward Blake entered, unannounced, looking tired but otherwise unharmed, and still wearing his same navy overcoat. A collective gasp went through the room. "You're alive!" Dora Maynard whispered. Regrettably for some, Blake said dryly. He did not look at the others. He looked directly at Miss Marple. "Your note was rather cryptic. I trust you have a good reason for summoning me back." "I believe so, Mr. Blake," Miss Marple replied mildly. "For this is not a confrontation. It is an unveiling." At her signal, Agnes wordlessly lifted the cloth from the central display case. Inside, gleaming under the lights, was the original lace fan, unburned, unbroken, unhidden. "But I thought," Mrs. Maynard began. "It was missing. Destroyed." "This fan," Miss Marple said, her voice clear and calm, "was not found in the archives, nor was it with Mr. Blake. It was returned by him last night, after he retrieved it from the bank vault in Salisbury where he had placed it for safekeeping." She let her words sink in. "Mr. Blake did not flee, you see. He acted to protect the one piece of evidence he knew was at the heart of everything, the real fan. The one on display at the reopening, that was a very clever fake." She began to speak, weaving the threads together for them all. She told of the parcel from Bayonne in 1947, of the non-existent Vivian Grey, and of Cordelia's 30-year deception. This secret, she said, corrupted everything it touched. It gave Cordelia the power to blackmail, to hold this village in a grip of quiet fear. Her gaze fell upon the Reverend. "You were stationed in France after the war, were you not, Mr. Maynard? In the office that processed reclaimed estate items." The Reverend took a step back, his face ashen. Dora turned to him, her mouth slightly agape. "Giles?" "She blackmailed me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I falsified one certificate. One. A lace parcel came through my station, from a confiscated estate. I signed it off as unclaimed. I thought the family had vanished. I never thought it would matter. But it did," Miss Marple said. "Cordelia discovered your signature on the paperwork years later and used it to ensure your silence. Your crime enabled hers." The confession hung in the air, seemingly solving everything. But Miss Marple held up a hand. "And yet, the Reverend is not a poisoner. He is a man consumed by guilt, not a killer trying to conceal it." Her voice softened. "The poison was administered patiently, over weeks. It was done by someone with daily access, with intimate knowledge of Cordelia's habits. It was done by someone who believed they were dispensing justice." Her kind, steady gaze moved, and came to rest on Agnes Bell. The silence that followed was absolute. Agnes stood perfectly still, her face a mask of sorrow. "You discovered the truth, didn't you, my dear?" Miss Marple said gently. "In the archives. You found the French note, the index card. You realized Cordelia's entire reputation was built on a lie, and that she was using it to torment the vicar and others. You confronted her." Agnes's voice, when it came, was hollow. She wouldn't confess. She wouldn't even admit it. She just smiled. "She was going to leave me the fan in her will," she said. "Let me clean up her mess after she was gone, without ever having to face the consequences herself." It was the ultimate act of cowardice. "And so you took matters into your own hands," Miss Marple said sadly. Agnes gave a small, broken laugh. She never let anyone touch her teacup. Not me, not anyone. But that evening, after she told me about the will, she was distracted. She left the tin of herbal leaves open on the desk. She was so proud of her secret little plan. It was just one slip. One moment of vanity. And that was enough, Miss Marple murmured. She would have kept lying, Agnes whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her pale cheeks. She would have taken it all to her grave and smiled doing it. Someone had to unravel the lie. Sergeant Webb stepped forward slowly. No one spoke. The truth, in all its tragic complexity, had been laid bare. The fan, the object of so much deceit, rested in its case, its delicate threads holding together a story of theft, blackmail, and a terrible, misguided righteousness. In the end, it was not a hardened criminal who had murdered Cordelia Faucet, but a quiet, diligent girl who had loved the idea of truth far more than she had loved any person. Chapter 11: The Aftermath. The silence following Agnes's confession was not the hush of confusion. It was the hush of a terrible, lucid understanding. Every eye in the room moved from the fan to the quiet young woman who had polished its case, logged its history, and ultimately killed for it. Sergeant Webb stepped forward, his movements slow and heavy. There was no triumph in his posture, only a profound weariness. "Agnes Bell," he said quietly, "I must ask you to come with me." Agnes did not resist. She looked once more at Miss Marple, her expression not of fear, but of a strange, exhausted relief, as if a great burden had finally been set down. As she was led from the museum, the assembled villagers watched her go, their earlier, simpler theories of jealousy and ambition dissolving into a much more unsettling reality. They had suspected her of a common crime. The truth was infinitely more complex and disturbing. Later that evening, as a low mist settled over the village, Edward Blake appeared at Miss Marple's door. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. "She fooled us all," he said, sinking into the armchair by the fire. "Even me." "Cordelia wasn't cruel by nature," Miss Marple said, pouring him a small glass of sherry. "Just frightened of being discovered. Frightened of being ordinary. I found out about the replica 2 months ago," Blake confessed, staring into the flames. "I was reviewing the insurance valuations and found an old invoice for a master copyist. It all unraveled from there. I confronted Cordelia. She admitted everything, even the blackmail of the vicar." He shook his head. "I urged her to come forward, to return the fan quietly. But she was too proud. Her will, that was her compromise. When I heard she was dead, and saw Agnes's face, I suspected the truth. I feared Agnes would destroy the real fan to erase the story forever, or worse, that I would be implicated in the whole sorry mess. Taking the fan and disappearing seemed the only way to control the situation until the truth could be brought to light. A logical, if rather dramatic, solution, Miss Marple noted. And now, Blake sighed, what becomes of it? The fan? It must go home, Mr. Blake, she said softly. Its journey has been far too long. Miss Marple reflected on the 2 women at the heart of the tragedy. One had lived a life built on a lie, a theft of property that grew into a theft of peace for the entire village. The other had tried to be righteous. And in doing so, she murmured to herself after Blake had left, Agnes committed the very sin she condemned in Cordelia. She believed, with all her heart, that she knew better than everyone else. Chapter 12: The Quiet End. The inquest was held in the village hall 3 days later. It was a somber affair, devoid of fanfare. Agnes Bell, advised by her solicitor, gave a full confession, her voice never wavering as she explained her motives, not greed or hatred, but a corrupted sense of justice. She had intended, she said, to protect the museum's honor, but Cordelia's refusal to confess her own sins had twisted that intention into something brittle and poisoned. The verdict, in light of the profound psychological pressure she had been under, was manslaughter. In Fau Glen, however, it wasn't the legal outcome that lingered. It was the motive. A week later, Sergeant Webb sat in Miss Marple's warm, quiet sitting room for the last time. A new fire had been lit, and the lace curtains danced faintly in the breeze from the open window. "You were right all along," Webb said, accepting a cup of tea. He looked less like a policeman and more like a man who had been given a difficult lesson. It wasn't a simple crime. It was a culmination. Miss Marple nodded, sipping her own tea. Agnes was angry, but not cruel. She thought she was correcting a great wrong. But one cannot unpick a lie with a murder, Sergeant. One only creates a darker, more tangled pattern. She smiled faintly. It was all there from the beginning, you see. The argument over a crooked label, Agnes's obsession with things being put right. Cordelia's talk of fakes. The Reverend's fear. Mr. Blake's tidiness. All the threads were there. It just took a little while to see how they were woven together. The next morning, the Lace Museum remained closed. A new sign hung on the door, written in the careful script of the parish clerk, temporarily closed for recataloguing. Please respect the past. The fan had already begun its final journey. After a quiet correspondence with the French authorities, it was discovered that the woman in the photograph had a surviving niece living in Paris. The fan, along with the original French note, was packed and shipped from the same post office that had received it 30 years before. Its story, at last, had found its proper ending. On her walk home, Miss Marple paused by the vicarage. Dora Maynard was tending to the roses. "He's much calmer now," she said, not looking up from her pruning. "Giles?" The truth coming out. I think it was a relief. She snipped a wilting bloom. Cordelia was always so precise. Always pruning everyone else's branches. I suppose eventually, someone was bound to decide she needed cutting back herself. Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply knelt, picked up a fallen petal, and placed it gently on the soil. That evening, she returned to her sitting room. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like dormant secrets. Her knitting lay forgotten in a basket by the hearth. She opened a drawer and removed the sepia photograph of the young woman holding the fan. She would likely never learn the woman's name. Some stories, she reflected, even when solved, leave corners in shadow. A face without a name, a life unknown, a small injustice that had rippled through time to cause such ruin. She placed the photograph back in its envelope, a final, silent witness to a long-concluded affair. Outside, the village of Fau Glen slept under a thin autumn moon, its surface once again calm and orderly. But Miss Marple knew, as she always knew, what tangled threads lay just beneath. She turned out the light.